I'm Dan Poblocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with artists working in the genre today. Today I get to fanboy out with author Lamar Giles, whom I would argue is the foremost expert on Freddy Krueger and all things Elm Street. I thought I was a Wes Craven obsessive, but then Lamar opened his mouth, and the knowledge that poured forth was almost frightening. The fear that Lamar offered for our chat is A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, which happens to be my favorite entry in the Elm Street franchise. Nancy Thompson returns to help a new generation of Elm Street kids, and future Oscar winner Patricia Arquette leads a motley group of her peers into a dream world where they all have superpowers. Lamar and I get into why it is absolutely fine to start any discussion of Elm Street with its second sequel. We also chat about sequels in general, about video rental culture of the 1980s and 90s, about early mimetic transmission through elementary age whisper networks, about how Hollywood handles dream imagery, as well as who usually is allowed to survive a slasher film. Lamar Giles has written many books for young readers, including the recent The Getaway and Epic Ellisons' Cosmos Camp. Static, Up All Night is his graphic novel debut with artist Paris Alleyne. It arrives November of 2023 from DC Comics. Before we start, in this episode, we discuss R-rated movies, and we quote some bad words from them because we had to. So use your own discretion if listening with young folk, which is strange to say because Lamar and I both found Freddy Krueger years before we made it through our first decade. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore our first fears. Hey Lamar, thanks for coming on and talking to me about our first fears. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on and to talk about Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, especially because I think out of that whole franchise, it really is my favorite and clearly yours too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's almost a fan consensus that 3 is the best one. I think there may be some debate between 3 and the original, but I've never heard anyone go like, Part 5, The Dream Child is my favorite, or Freddy's Dead is my favorite. Like I've never heard that before. It's always been 3 or 1 in contention for the top spot, and almost everyone I know who enjoys these films lean towards 3.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But before we do, and like I ask all of the guests who come onto this show, if you could briefly tell the listeners about yourself, your work, and your relationship to the horror genre, maybe?
Certainly. So my name is Lamar Giles, and I'm a children's author for the most part. I write middle grade and young adult books. I've published many of them over the years. My most recent young adult book to come out was The Getaway, and my most recent middle grade book was Epic Ellisons' Cosmos Camp. Getaway is dystopian horror. Cosmos Camp is probably more of a quirky fantasy, but there's a little twinge of horror elements mixed in there because it tends to make its way into my work. The horror genre was probably the first genre I fell in love with from being a kid in a factory town in Virginia during the onset of the video rental revolution, which I'm sure we'll get into. Always enjoyed watching horror films with my cousin, reading scary books, particularly Stephen King novels growing up. And it's just always been a part of my storytelling DNA, whether it's the stories I consume or the stories I make.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I read The Getaway sometime this year. I think it was earlier this year as we met last year at the Virginia Children's Book Festival, did a couple of events together with Tiffany D. Jackson, and they were a lot of fun. And I thank you for including me in those.
It was my pleasure. We had a great time.
Yeah, yeah. No, the Getaway was awesome. Like really,
Thank you.
I'm recommending it to everybody. So it touches on a bunch of stuff that I love. The theme park stuff, the dystopian stuff, and the fighting against oppression, authority, all of
Well,
that stuff.
thank you so
Yeah.
much, thank you.
So
And I'll say this
yeah.
too before we get going for the listeners. I'm sure your listeners are already familiar with your work, but Tales to Keep You Up at Night. Loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you. You sent me a copy of the sequel. I have it right here on my right beside my desk. And as soon
Oh,
as I
sweet.
finish my current project, I'm diving into that.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. The second question I am asking everybody is, do you recall the first time you ever felt frightened?
Yes, I do. It's a weird story though. It's a super weird story,
Okay,
but
do it.
it has to do with VHS rentals
Okay.
because in my hometown when I was very little, we had a store. It wasn't any sort of big corporatized store like we would eventually get, the Blockbusters. We had one called Movie Gallery, which I think was owned by some umbrella corporation. This was a locally owned store called Movie Junction. My third grade teacher owned it. I wasn't in third grade at the time yet when this happened. It was like a Sunday night and my mom went there to rent something she wanted to watch. I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 at the time, and I wandered off into the horror section, just looking at the box art. And if you
Hmm.
remember how horror box art and horror book covers were in the 80s, like
Hmm.
very gruesome stuff. And I
Hmm.
remember keying on this zombie movie, which the title eludes me now, but the cover is very gruesome. There's some rotting dead person on the front, an army of rotting dead people behind them, that sort of thing. Terrifying. And my mom picks her movie, gets me, we get in the car to go home. And this is around the time where I can really consciously remember having to sleep in my own bedroom, being afraid of the dark, things
Hmm.
under the bed. And so as we're going home, this covers in my mind, and I'm terrified of the idea of I got to go home, go to bed, sleep by myself. And so as we're going home, my mom has the radio on. It's the 80s. This R&B song called "Shake You Down" by Gregory Abbott came on. And this is just a regular 80s R&B song about a guy who sees a girl across the dance floor. It's very mild, but to this day, I associate that song to that scary VHS cover, and that song will still trigger a twinge of fear in me whenever it comes on. And my wife thinks it's super weird because again, this song is nothing. There's nothing scary about this song, but it's this little intro in the beginning, like this alto saxophone, and I'm like, I can't stand it. Turn it off. Still thinking about zombies, but that's the
That,
first time I recall truly feeling fear.
that is incredible. I've been waiting for somebody on the show to talk about 80s music and music videos in particular, because those were some of I was God, I was a young kid in the early 80s. I had similar reactions to certain songs that would come on the radio. Like I remember, wow, what was his name? Rockwell.
Yes, yes, somebody's watching me.
Somebody's watching me.
Yes,
That song scared the patootie out of me. And Billy Joel had a video called for Under Pressure or Pressure, something
yes,
like that.
yes.
And I remember watching the video for that, and there's a moment where he gets swallowed up by a shag carpet. I don't know if you remember that,
I do.
but I had a fear of walking on carpets and rugs. I was probably 5 years old. Fear of walking on carpets and rugs for a very long time. And every time that song would come on, I had that same twinge that you described of fear. And I appreciate that. I appreciate what you just said. So
It's something about the 80s visual video aesthetics
yeah.
that if not horror genre definitely. I mean, I even think about one of the more popular ones which is the Aha video where they're
Hmm.
moving in and out of reality and the sketched world.
Hmm.
That scared me. Like the idea of
Hmm.
like you could travel through a framed photo into this world where everything is in the style of that photo, and
Hmm.
I think probably those directors were had some aspirations to break into horror at some point too. Maybe some of them did.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I was just talking with my friend Joey Valisi about the film Pet Cemetery, and
Hmm.
I think the director is Mary Lambert.
Yes.
Um, and he informed me that she directed Madonna's Like a Prayer. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there was an overlap with some of those early 80s MTV videos and some of the horror movies that came out a little bit later. I think you're right. I think that might have been their sort of foothold into the horror genre or in getting into Hollywood, films in general.
I mean, and you can kind of understand it to a degree, particularly if you think about the massive success of Michael Jackson and Thriller at the time, which correct, John Landis directed Thriller, right?
I
I
think
think
so.
I think so. So I mean, like that it's probably a lot of, hey, Michael Jackson meets horror meets director leads
Mm,
to all this outward success. It's probably a lot of people trying to duplicate that pattern. I mean, we see it in our work now where something hits and people sort of angle towards that formula. So
yeah.
it doesn't seem far fetched to me that people would see, like I said, taking Thriller as the prime example of, hey, there's ways to work this, make great music, shine, and kind of get my name out there.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It really does. And we kind of grew up in a golden age of that. So lucky us.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, to just give listeners the rundown of the film we're talking about, Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors. A film came out in 1987, directed by Chuck Russell, written by Wes Craven, Bruce Wagner, Frank Darabont, who went on to many other interesting horror properties, and the final writing credit goes to Chuck Russell as well. Produced by Robert Shea and Wes Craven, starring, and this is a long list because it has a big cast, Heather Langenkamp as Nancy Thompson, Craig Wasson as Dr. Neil Gordon, Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, and then the Dream Warriors crew themselves, Patricia Arquette as Kristen, Ken Sagos as Kincaid, Rodney Eastman as Joey, Jennifer Rubin, who I love, as Taryn, Bradley Gregg as Philip, Penelope Sudrow as Jennifer, Ira Hayden as Will, and Larry Fishburne as Max, the orderly, also known as Lawrence Fishburne. So yeah, that's the big basic rundown of the film. Do you want to give the listeners a synopsis of the film? Maybe
Sure.
also touch on how, like, the history of Freddy Krueger in part one, just for people who, I don't know who they might be, but who don't know who Freddy Krueger or Nightmare on Elm Street, what this is all about.
Sure.
Spoiler alert to everybody.
Sure. So I'll try to do the synopsis first, and then we'll backtrack on Freddy.
Okay.
So after what appears to be a failed suicide attempt, teenager Kristen Parker is committed to the Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital, in a ward with several other teens who also have survived suicide attempts. When Nancy Thompson, a grad student and intern, comes to work at the hospital, they discover that the children didn't try to kill themselves. They were attacked in their dreams by a deceased child killer slash dream demon, Freddy Krueger. Nancy, being a survivor of a former attack by Freddy, is able to piece together that Kristen has a very special ability, which is she can pull people into her dreams. That, combined with the other kids' abilities to manifest what are essentially superpowers when they're in the dream world, allow them to band together in an effort to vanquish Krueger before he picks them off one by one. And that's three. The history, which is Nancy's history, goes back to the initial film where her friends were under attack, being picked off one by one by this entity they knew nothing about, until Nancy discovered there was a man in the neighborhood named Freddy Krueger who used to kill children. And when he was released on a legal technicality, the parents of the neighborhood banded together and lynched him. They burned him alive. And as revenge, he comes back in the dreams of their children. If he can kill you in the dream, you die for real.
Yeah, I mean, that was perfect.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it or written it any better. It feels like you might have memorized that
I,
somehow.
I have spent many years, many years with this information in my head. So you have given me the pressure valve, the ability to
Yes.
spew it out.
Nice, nice. So I guess I want to start with the idea of Freddy Krueger as the boogeyman, or as the boogeyman archetype. He is called the boogeyman many times in these films. And I guess my question for you is, what is the slash a boogeyman?
Well, honestly, if we're taking boogeyman applied to Krueger, I think one read of it is the boogeyman is the generational divide between X generation and Y generation, in the sense of these parents cannot be convinced by their children that the children understand there's a problem,
Hmm.
and it's a problem unique to them. And the parental advice that they give these children is just do the very thing that will make the problem destroy you. And I think in this regard, the movies, the nightmare movies, Freddy is that thing that every generation goes through where their problems are vastly different from their parents' problems. And the parents just simply will not believe that these children have the autonomy to evaluate their own circumstances, their own dangers, and express that the way you solved your problems in the past do not apply here.
Hmm.
I hope that makes sense. That's that.
It makes sense. It's a broad and metaphorical definition of boogeyman, but it does make sense, and it's very interesting to think about because clearly the parent-child relationships in these films is very, very significant, starting in the first film where Nancy's mother, played by Ronnie Blakely, who's just wonderful, she just is drinking herself into a stupor to forget and like very disconnected from her child and making all sorts of mistakes like putting bars on all of the windows to keep Nancy inside the house, or keep people from coming outside of the house. Lots of stupid decisions on the
Yeah,
parents'
yeah.
part. Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. In terms of pop culture references to the boogeyman idea, I feel like the 70s and 80s gave us a lot of them. Michael Myers from the Halloween movies was like the prototypical boogeyman, also called the boogeyman in that film. I think there's something about the question somewhere deep inside what I'm saying is, having Freddy Krueger being named as the boogeyman, I feel like has a power to help us as the viewer and maybe the characters in the film to make meaning of their fears and process their fears. Do you see anything in that, or like calling, like being able to say, oh well, it's the boogeyman, it's Freddy Krueger, like all of those things that you talked about as like kind of like a metaphorical situation between the parents and the kids, like if they can take all of that meaning and focus it at an evil character, is that easier for us to process fear?
Yeah, sure. I think anytime you can name something, it's easier to process. And if you're comparing it to the other slashers of the 80s, like you
Hmm.
said, Michael Myers was called the boogeyman. I don't think it was ever applied to Jason, but I think you could argue that someone probably thought of him that way. I think Freddy, in my mind, is the most potent example of
Hmm.
what the boogeyman traditionally means when I think of it, which is like something that you may not be able to vanquish because and naming it gives you some power, but it's also like I know the name of the thing that can destroy me,
Hmm.
and I may not be able to stop it. To me, that speaks to more existential fear,
Hmm.
um, in reality, in day to day life, more so than the Michael Myers or the Jasons, because
Hmm.
the truth of like say a Jason, you never have to go to Crystal Lake, you never ever have to go. Michael Myers and I think it was a Haddonfield. Was that the name of the town? I can't remember.
Yeah.
After the first two times, I think you could decide like, hey, October we're going to take a cruise. You know, we're just not going to be in town. But Freddy as the boogeyman to me speaks to like existential fear
Hmm.
that everybody deals with because you got to go to sleep. You got to go to sleep. This guy can get to you at your most vulnerable. And if you don't understand him and his abilities and his powers, which most people in these movies do not until the third act, he's got you. There's absolutely nothing you can do. And I think that mirrors just like the fear we can feel about economics, about job security, about real world mass murderers running
Hmm.
into a place where you're shopping with your children.
Hmm.
Freddie, to me, is the closest example to real danger.
Hmm.
And that metaphor of the boogeyman fits him perfectly. I think every day we go out of our house, we could run into a boogeyman.
Hmm. Yeah.
And what do? And Freddy's worse in the sense because even if you hold up in your house and decided I'm not going to go out and face the world, you're going to doze off eventually.
You still have to fall asleep. It's
Mm.
like it's like death and taxes. You got to
Yeah.
take a nap sometime.
Yep. Yep.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's intense. One of the things that keeps the characters going in this film, and which I think sets this film apart from the other Elm Street films and many other slasher horror films from the 80s, 90s, today, is the idea of these kids coming together. They are the dream warriors. They have something in common. They bicker, they fight, but they are siblings. They are part of each other's found family. They get it, they understand what each other is going through. And I wanted to mention, and if you don't want to talk about this, you don't have to, but I wanted to mention in the Getaway, in your dedication page, you wrote for the Vista Way crew, spring 2000. Um, and I wanted to sort of see, I mean, clearly you connect with the idea of having a crew, having people and peers. Who are the Vista Way crew? What do they mean to you? Or like, were they your dream warriors?
They were my dream warriors. The Vista Way crew. I should probably say what the Getaway is about because this will give
Yeah, yeah,
context.
yeah.
The Getaway is about a boy named Jay Butler who lives and works at a world famous vacation resort called Karloff Country in the near future. Karloff Country is for the wealthy. It's got high walls, great amenities, and it's the place to be because beyond those walls, the world is suffering. Hard to get money, hard to get medicine, hard to get food. And when society collapses, the rich billionaires who built the place flee to Karloff Country to ride out a self inflicted apocalypse. And they expect Jay, his family, and his friends to give them 5-star service, whether they like it or not. And it's inspired by my time working for a world famous resort that I
Mm-hmm.
won't name because they are very litigious. Vista
Mm-hmm.
Way may give it away if you could Google. But while I was working for this resort, we lived in a complex called Vista Way Apartments.
Mm-hmm.
And the friends I made there during the spring of 2000, we all aided each other in getting through what for some of us was a traumatic living and working experience.
Mm-hmm.
Not too dissimilar from the kids committed to Weston Hills
Mm-hmm.
dealing. I would say the entity we worked for was as powerful as Krueger.
I believe it.
Take what you will.
Yes. Okay.
Similar powers and everything. Take what you will
Oh,
from that.
wow. That does sound scary though,
Yeah,
Lamar. It really
yeah,
does.
yeah.
It's interesting. So you guys had this bond over this kind of traumatic, slightly traumatic or however you're defining it, working experience. Did you feel like each of you sort of brought something to the table in the way the Dream Warriors sort of brought something to the table? Like, was there a Nancy Thompson came in? Was a surrogate mother to you or a surrogate parent to you?
Not a surrogate. No, we didn't have a Nancy. We didn't have a Nancy. We were like the kids before Nancy got there, I guess. Before Nancy and Kristen got there, but certainly within that crew. And I still talk to two of those people to this day via social media, the way we often communicate these days.
Yeah.
I just remember like two of those people, they were the lifeline. Like, we could commiserate about our working experiences. We would hang out in our off hours. We would comfort each other knowing we were all far away from home and knowing that eventually we'd get back to our families and our friends at our homes. But at the time, we were like found family. And I mean, that's something that really resonated with me. And I mean, it's interesting. Like, I wouldn't have made the connection between Vista Way, the crew in the Getaway, and the Weston Hills crew until this moment. Until this moment. But now I can see. I mean, like I said, this movie and this franchise is probably embedded in my storytelling DNA. And so
Mm,
now that you say it, I can see where even in the book, I'm sort of channeling some of the Dream Warriors and the
yeah.
characters Seychelle, Jay, Zeke, and Connie.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we each as creators and artists, we are inspired by things that we loved when we were kids. Is one of the reasons I wanted to start having these kinds of conversations with writers and artists and creators, is to sort of dig in and see how these memories of the things that scared us, the things that we loved, affected our work later on. Can you draw a connection between Dream Warriors maybe in some of your other books?
Yeah, honestly, I think the book that probably leans on the Dream Warriors most, and it's not a genre book, it's a contemporary coming of age story, my novel, Not So Pure and Simple, which is about a boy who accidentally joins a purity pledge at his church to get closer to a girl he likes. And it sort of triggers this weird chain of events in his town as the church and his school battle about what children should know about these carnal subjects.
Hmm.
Again, this is not a genre book, but I've often found that the horror influences from childhood, teenage years, and on up will sometimes leak and fit perfectly into differing genres. And so, like the idea of the Dream Warriors, that found family with the distinct personalities that they clash but also have a common goal, I think it comes out in the crew of kids I wrote that are in that purity pledge. And so, in that situation, I guess you could argue that the Krueger of the world is all the adults who just simply don't want them to know things
Hmm.
that they need to know to progress and become adults themselves.
That sounds really familiar
Yeah,
right now in
yeah,
today's
yeah,
climate
yeah,
with
yeah.
certain adults not wanting kids to know literal facts and literal history and literal people that exist currently in our country. It's incredible. Yeah.
It's hiding the boogeyman again, right?
Hmm.
You don't need to know these things. Just go to sleep. All you need to do is go to sleep.
Oh
It's
my
fine if
God.
you go to sleep.
Wow. Wow. You're blowing my mind. But going to sleep will kill you,
Yeah,
literally.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, let's talk about the Dream Warriors themselves. Kristen, Kincaid, Joey, Taryn, Philip, Jennifer, and Will. So we've talked about that they in their dreams have superpowers. Can you name what the superpowers are? Because some of them seem blurry to me. Some of them seem very, very clear.
So
Um,
in Dream Warriors, the powers are only limited by their imaginations and the film's budget. The film's budget being the primary limitation. Therefore, the superpowers go like this. Kristen has the ability to pull people into her dreams and perform middling gymnastics. Um, she would not be able to compete with Simone Biles.
no,
Let's
she
just no one can. No one can compete with Simone Biles,
no.
but especially Kristen. But her powers are middling gymnastics. Um, Kincaid's power is medium strength. It's not super
Yes,
strength. It's
medium
medium
strength.
strength.
Yeah.
He can bend chairs and burst through wooden doors, which I think probably any generously sized man could do. uh,
True.
uh, Will actually has magical powers. He's like a sorcerer in his
Hmm.
dreams, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Taryn's powers seem to lean more towards her expressing her full self esteem.
Hmm.
She sees herself very differently in the dream. The line is, "I'm beautiful and I'm bad."
And I'm bad.
Um,
And she pulls out
it
those
pulls out
switchblades.
Switchblade. Yeah, so it seems to be more of a confidence boost in her dreams. Um,
Which feels like she might be the most powerful of
yeah,
them in terms of fight. When she does fight Freddy,
yeah,
she
yeah,
does get some stuff over on him. So
yeah. She doesn't back down at all. I mean, like she's all. I think she's almost fearless in the moment.
hmm.
Philip, we he has in real life he has the talent to make very intricate puppets.
Hmm.
I guess are we in the spoilers now? Because
Oh,
yeah,
we've been spoiling the whole thing. Let's spoil it.
sadly we don't get to see much of what Philip is capable of in the
No.
dreams because Freddie gets to him fairly early. Jennifer, we don't ever see what she's capable of. She wants to
Yeah.
be an
No.
actor.
Yeah.
She has aspirations to succeed in Hollywood, but Freddie gets to her fairly early. And then Joey is mute throughout most of the film, and his power manifests as a powerful sonic blast when he's able to finally speak.
That's right. That's right.
So I think I covered them all. I'd like to say we talk about Nancy never displayed any power beyond just her extra knowledge of having dealt with Krueger in the past.
Yeah. Why do you think in this film the Elm Street kids, as Nancy calls them, why are they superpowered rather than say Tina or the kids from the first movie?
If I'm being honest, I think it's more of a logical progression
Hmm.
of the mythos
Hmm.
versus them being vastly different than the kids in the first movies. I think Wes Craven just hadn't really either thought through to the logical progression of what people can do in dreams,
Mm-hmm.
or was somehow otherwise limited, maybe budget wise. But I think in the first film, what you see represented in dreams is more of a generalized, broad spectrum of, we all had dreams where we run and we can't get away, or we've all had
Mm-hmm.
dreams where, there's a scary person in the shadows. Where I think I think this was more Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont's contributions to this script, where they made it specific to the person's personality.
Yeah.
The idea that in your dream, you will do this very thing that you've always desired. And that's something that can empower you, but also can be used against you by the dream demon.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of this. We can talk about this as a sequel now. It's an interesting conversation that we're having, because we're starting the first conversation about Freddy Krueger on this podcast with the third film in this series, which totally works for me. But we can talk about, yeah.
I'll speak to that too, because we're also talking about the VHS era.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a couple reasons this particular film sticks with me out of the franchise. But this was the first VHS I rented on my own.
Mm.
My mother was a factory worker. She worked shift work, so her hours would change week to week. And so I would spend a lot of time at my grandparents' house, where they were older people. I was a young kid. They had no problem letting me watch TV a lot to kind of like give themselves a break.
Yes.
And understandably so. I get it. And my mom just wanted to make sure I was somewhere safe and I wasn't being a pest to the people who assisted in my childcare, was happy to let me rent movies to pass the time. And I don't think she really understood what I was renting
Mm-hmm.
when I picked this movie out. But this was a point when she had gotten me my own video rental card. For those who don't know, you used to have a card to present to the people. And she signed the permission slip where I could rent what I want in the store. And this was the first movie I picked out on my own.
Wow.
So that was my introduction to Elm Street. I watched 3 before I saw 1.
Wow. Okay.
That's my excuse for getting here before we got to Wes Craven's original.
I remember my own hometown video rental store. It was in Manville, Rhode Island, which was several towns over from where I was living, which was Lincoln. I remember one of the first times I ever went in there, there were big promotional cardboard cutouts, stand at like life-size Freddy Krueger displaying the glove next to his face for Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. I had not heard of Freddy Krueger. I had not heard of Nightmare on Elm Street. And I was like, who's this man with this horrible face? And I was just intrigued. I was probably 6 years old, maybe a little bit older, 6 or 7. I remember also being intrigued by the horror section at the back of the store, and I would go through and pore over the VHS covers, kind of like you did. My introduction to this franchise was Freddy's Revenge.
Yes.
And I think it was my family friends were able to somehow get the film number 2, and we all watched that together. And that one is unique in its own ways. We don't have to get into that stuff right here, but yeah, that was my introduction to Freddy Krueger.
I mean, and you can tell me how it was for you, because I was roughly the same age around the time all that was happening. There was also this sense of sort of like whispered community in my school. Like where you would hear other kids talk about this scary movie that they saw somehow in a way you very much described, like, a family friend or a cousin, or they were able to sit and watch these things at home. And you wanted to be part of that. Like you wanted to be able to talk about Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers, or Return of the Living Dead at the time, but when zombies were making their reemergence.
Oh yeah.
It was that sort of thing where you didn't want to be left out either, because it seems like other people were getting their hands on this stuff. And and I also very much remember having friends whose parents were staunchly against them having any exposure to any sort of horror, science fiction, fantasy. This was very much a time of satanic panic.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was trying to corrupt children to the devil. So it was interesting times.
Oh yeah. Growing up in that time, I didn't know any other way. I just thought, from what I was hearing, from what my mother was learning and what her own fears were. Like anything that had to do with the devil or Satan was an absolute no-no for me. So I wasn't allowed to look at Dungeons and Dragons because the propaganda,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
spread so insidiously against that. But I'm so glad you brought up like the whisper connection, because that was part of why I was intrigued to see at least Freddy's Revenge. And then Friends, before I even saw the first movie, Friends told me every scary thing that happened. They were like, there's this moment in a school hallway where this girl appears in a bloody body bag. And that image, when I finally saw it for myself, like it absolutely lived up to the Whisper Network's
Absolutely.
description of it.
I remember kids in the school hall would just do the sound of Freddy's claws against metal. That
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that was like a huge thing when I was a kid. And you wanted to be a part of that. You didn't want to be left out. And then when you got to be a part of it, you're like, this is awesome. This is incredible.
Yeah, yeah. It leads me to a question that I had, and this is a question I've had for a long time. Something that was confusing to me as a kid and is still kind of confusing to me as an adult. Like clearly, this movie was made. This series was made for young people, whether the adults who made it or the gatekeepers wanted to admit it or not. I do believe that this series was made for young viewers. Despite the fact that they knew it was going to get an R rating, we technically were not allowed to see it. You had special permission. I had to sneak to a neighbor's house to see this. I'm wondering, was this why video stores became so popular in the 80s? Because we as kids were not going to be able to go into the theaters to see these films, at least not without our parents, who many of them were reluctant. But we were able to get around the rules by bringing the film home and watching it with our friends, like after dark at a sleepover or whatever.
No, I certainly think that was part of the popularity. I mean, 'cause I wasn't alive, or I don't have conscious memories of the time before video stores existed. But I've heard the stories and understand that before you had the option to go into the store and see a movie you might have missed in theaters. If you missed it in the theater, you might not ever see it again.
Mm-hmm.
And like this, so this idea that, hey, I don't have to spend a lot of money to take my family to the theater. I can now wait and play this movie in my home. We can all watch and enjoy it. I think it certainly was part of the popularity. I think it played into the economics of the time. Again, not that I have a vast understanding of 80s economics. I was a kid, but I understand, from what I understand, it felt like now where everything's way more expensive than the average person wants to pay. So when you have this option of, I pay this low price, and I think it was something like $2 at the time. I
Okay.
rent this movie for $2 for 3 nights,
Mm-hmm.
and my home family can sit down where it would have cost me $10 to take me to the theater. That's just a deal you can't beat if you can be patient.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember our family getting our first VCR.
Yeah.
And for some reason, my grandparents ended up getting a VCR before we did. And so I was fascinated by them and what they were able to do. And they'd take us to the video store and rent, cartoon stuff. And this was only a few years before I saw Nightmare on Elm Street and all that stuff. But it's also incredible that like $2 for a 3-night rental. Now you can rent a film off of Amazon or wherever you rent films, and it's really only doubled.
Yeah, yeah. It's probably
It's still
it's
pretty
probably
affordable.
it's had the kindest reaction to inflation, I think, of many of the things we still indulge in. But it was such a special time. Then when it became affordable to own your favorite movies, I remember that period very fondly.
Mhm.
Going into, I guess it probably would have been a Kmart at the time, and buying bargain VHS tapes.
The bargains. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I picked up many, many favorites that way. It was magical, I think. I think it really has imprinted on me, and I'm grateful that my mom didn't stand in the way of me consuming the media I wanted to consume. Though I know many parents probably would have looked down on her for it. I don't think I'd be here doing the work I do or talking to you about the subject if not for that.
I had a similar experience. I think I hit a certain age. It might have been 9 or 10, and my mom just kind of gave in to what she knew I wanted. She knew I liked scary stuff. She knew it helped me in a way deal with my fears. I remember she went to the video store by herself one day and called me on the phone. I was at home. She was like, "There's this new movie out on VHS called The Lost Boys. It's about vampires. Do you want me to rent it for you?" I was like, head exploded. I was like, hell yes.
That was a big one for me too. That was a big movie for me too. I love The Lost Boys.
Oh my God. I just have to give a shout out to my mom right now. Thank you so much for bringing home The Lost Boys when I was like 10 years old. Like, what an incredibly cool thing to do. But
Yeah, your mom was awesome for that.
Yeah, well, your parents are awesome for letting you do that too. So we're lucky. I also I want to mention one of my first jobs ever when I was in high school was working at my local video store. And I think this was definitely before DVDs. So VHS was still a thing that was happening. I worked at National Video at the Lions Mall in Basking Ridge, New Jersey for a short time, but I thought I was going to love it so much, but it wasn't. I didn't get to recommend the movies I wanted to watch. I didn't get to do the things that I wanted to do in the store. It was a retail job.
Yeah.
But the fun thing was that the best part was that any night I could take home 3 tapes for free. And that was kind of how I built up a pretty big knowledge of horror films, of art house films in the 90s, like all that stuff. That was pretty cool. I feel like I can wear that as a badge of honor.
Well, in college, I worked at a Blockbuster. It wasn't the charm of a local video store, but similar benefits and similar revelations, where being in that environment of movies all the time, I thought it would be more fun than it ended up being. As you said, it was a retail job. We could probably swap various nightmare retail stories. I think the worst one I had was, we had the drop box where people would drop their movies in the slot, and you had to empty that out every few hours. And I remember pulling out a DVD case, and opening it up, and 2 roaches skittered up my arm and jumped, and then jumped. They jumped off my arm like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, and escaped to somewhere in the store. And that was probably very close to my last few months at Blockbuster. But I remember very vividly putting in that person's account notes, roaches, just all caps.
and whoever came across that note, who knows what that means? I mean, it'll be a mystery forever. It could mean anything. That's incredible. My horror story sort of came from management. And no offense to anybody from back in the day at National Video, please. I appreciate all of you. But I didn't want to, somebody had a late charge on their account or whatever. Like, I just felt so guilty that I felt guilty not being allowed to let them rent their next video without paying that fine. So I would do that all the time and be like, well, you just have to pay it next time. And oh boy, I got yelled at for that. So
because I think the Blockbuster system wouldn't even let them out the door with the new movie without them clearing that account.
Oh, yeah.
So I would appreciate you having, the sensitivity and giving people leeway, because some of those charges were just silly. I mean, you're talking like a day late, but I guess that's probably a whole other conversation.
I mean, it makes sense to me now, but also like I was a teenager and I wanted to say, screw you. I'm going to let these people do what they want.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the slasher sequel.
Sure.
The idea of a slasher sequel. I feel like there are rules or tropes they've been discussed in meta cinema over the past 20 years or so. It's the Scream films kind of doing the best commentary on what a sequel is supposed to do or what it can do. And I think there's a lot of overlap in indications of Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors being part of that trope factory. Like, we've got a wider scope here, bigger special effects than the first 2. They might have had a bigger budget. I don't know. We've got more backstory. We learn about Freddy Krueger's mom, who appears in the film in certain ways. And we learn the legend of him being the bastard son of 100 maniacs. It's a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah.
Freddy in this movie starts to do more of his what later became the iconic quips. The thing, I think we've kind of touched on this already, but the MO, like his MO sort of changes from the first film. In Elm Street 1, we see the magic of the dreams invading the real world. So Freddy really is the dream demon. And like, for example, Tina, the first victim, her boyfriend sees her flying around the room in the real world, getting sort of eviscerated by Freddy's glove. And near the end of the film, Johnny Depp's character, his mom opens the door and witnesses the blood pouring up onto the ceiling after he's pulled down into the bed by Freddy's glove. But in Dream Warriors, the argument is that the kids are doing harm to themselves. And we see that in the first early moment with Kristen, and how she's imagining her sink is attacking her and slicing at her arm, like with Freddy's, the claws kind of come out of the sink knobs and slash at her. And her mom opens the door and finds her holding a blade, and she has cut herself. How does this change work for you? Like the evolution of how the mechanics of Freddy's world work for you in terms of the mythology? Is that okay? Is this good storytelling? Is it
I,
a flaw?
I could reason it out several ways. Like I do think it's an improvement, and I can live with it. There's a part of me that wonders if Freddie at some point was like, the medical examiners in Springwood are going to be a problem for me.
Yes.
Can't really sell a blood geyser from someone's bed. But this
Got to
kid,
be discreet.
got to be a little more discreet if I want to avoid the parental. So on one level, I can reason it out that way. If I have to be serious with the mythos, you could argue that Freddy's getting more experience and stronger, and therefore doing different things. I think 3 is the movie where Freddy was scary for the last time. And I think it was because of those mythology expansions. The chief one being the one that I still find horrific to this day is the reveal that when Freddy kills a child, they don't just go on to whatever their final fate is, heaven, which I think is reasonable considering the root of the mythology. Instead, they are suffering from being absorbed by Freddy. They appear to be in agony as he feeds off the energy of their souls.
And they're in his
chest.
Skin.
They're in his skin. They're screaming. Skin. They're screaming in agony. Their faces puckering his chest. This was the most horrific reveal to me. Solidified Freddy. I mean, he was already a horrid monster, but this made him as scary to me as the Cenobites and Hellraiser. Because what you're essentially talking about is an eternal punishment if nothing can be done about it.
For kids.
For children. That expansion of the mythos, I think, was true horror. And, I think Russell talked about this, is the idea they wanted to bring in the gravitas of Catholicism and Christianity. The way Freddy was dispatched with holy water and a crucifix.
Which was a very 80s thing. Satanic panic thing.
But does it work for me? Yes. I think it was a good expansion up to that point. But I think beyond that, it's what you said. It becomes expanding to me in sillier directions, the quips. The dream murders become more tongue-in-cheek. I think by the time we get to Freddy's Dead, Freddy's literally Bugs Bunny.
That was number 6, right? That was the
Yes, that was number 6.
one?
Yep. I saw that in theaters.
Me too.
A couple of times with my 3D glasses. The 3D part really sold me. I mean, by honest assessment, it wasn't a great film, but I think by the time you get there, it's very little horror and more comedy.
Oh yeah.
But 3 to me was the peak of the mythos expansion, and it did work for me.
I agree. So the future films, they do have they become more about the kills, right? Like in many horror sequels, like in Friday the 13th in particular, like Jason just gets more and more creative. And Freddy gets more and more creative in the further films. But I feel like this film in particular, it's always very strange to talk about the kills in a slasher film, but it's a trope. If we're going to talk about it, we have to talk about it. This film is so gory and they're so creative, and I feel like that's part of why this film is so popular, because the special effects are wild. We get a giant Freddy snake monster that's devouring Patricia Arquette from the legs down. We get that scene with what's his name?
Philip.
No, yeah, Philip. Yeah, you want to talk about the Philip scene?
Yeah, the Philip kill, because Philip's thing was puppets, when Freddy came for him, he essentially turned Philip into a puppet,
Mm.
using his tendons as the puppet strings, walking him from his room through the facility up to a tower where he then cuts the puppet strings, forcing Philip to fling himself from the tower to the outside world. It presents as if he simply took his own life by jumping,
Yeah.
where in actuality it was Freddy piloting him the whole time. Some
From
questions
way,
about
way up
yeah,
above in
yeah,
the
yeah,
sky.
yeah. So there's
Very
some serious
surreal.
questions about Freddy's power level in that scene,
Yeah.
because he's the thing is, Philip's known for sleepwalking. So
Mhm.
when his roommate wakes up and sees him struggling out the room, Kincaid, he dismisses it as another sleepwalking episode.
Oh,
But
Kincaid.
oh, Kincaid. Um, but he's Freddy appears to be able to move these kids through solid matter when
Yeah.
he wants,
Right through the
because
door.
through the door. I'm unclear exactly how powerful Freddy is in this movie. I mean, he seems to be godlike. But that is the Philip kill, and then we have the Jennifer kill, which is a little more subtle, not much more subtle, a little more subtle because it takes place in the TV room with
Oh my
Freddy,
God. It's
with
so good.
Freddy's arms coming out of the side of the TV, but they're constructed as like wires and metal, and his
Yeah.
head coming out of the top of the TV with the TV antennas
Oh
moving
my
in
God.
his scalp like bug antennas, and
Yeah.
he slams her face first through the screen.
But
Um,
not before he says, I think, the most iconic line in all of Elm Street. I would argue
Okay,
in all of the Elm
I
Street.
think that is a fair argument. The most iconic quip, and honestly, to me, the quip that started it all, because I don't think
Mm,
he was talking like that
no,
in one and two. But
no.
once this line happened, every movie we're trying to go for something similar, but it never quite lands.
Yeah.
And can we curse on your podcast? Because I'll
Yeah.
say it.
Say it. Because do the
So
line.
so as soon as he makes contact with Jennifer, he's this is it, Jennifer, your big break in TV. There's a beat. Then he says, "Welcome to prime time, bitch." Slams her head into the screen. That "Welcome to prime time" line is probably the most quoted of
Yeah.
anything Robert Englund's ever said in his life, and the man's
Yep.
been acting for decades.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really iconic. It's really incredible. It's the mix of those special effects, the dialogue that's happening there, the performance by Penelope Sudrow. She really good. Like the performances of all of the Dream Warrior, the
They're all
warriors,
good.
the
They're
kids
all
are
good.
they're so they play scared so well, and you see everything flashing before her eyes.
Mm,
Her dream of going to Hollywood and being a star. And like he just takes that away from her. Not
yeah.
only does he kill her, but like right before that, he lets her know, like, you'll never
Hmm.
do this thing that you wanted to do, which is so cruel.
It is. I mean, Krueger is one of the cruelest slashers, because you could argue Jason's malice is clearly there in everything he does. But in some ways, the kills are brutally quick. We know now that Freddy will taunt you, use your greatest desires against you, and then feed on your soul for as long as he's allowed to. And so, in my mind, again, he puts him right up there with the Cenobites. But I could argue in the Hellraiser movies, the Cenobites typically come when you call them.
Mm-hmm.
You've played with something you weren't supposed to. You've been the architect of your own destruction. Freddy
Mm-hmm.
is something that you did not bring upon yourself. You is like, as they quote in the movie, as they say in the movie, the sins of the father, the sins of the parents bring him
Yes,
on.
yes.
But that line, "Welcome to prime time," and you may know this already, but that was an ad lib. Robert Englund ad
Oh
libbed that.
no, I didn't know that. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
he said, because he had the original line, which is "This is it, Jennifer, your big break in TV." I think as it's scripted, that was supposed to be the moment of the kill, but he said it didn't feel right. It didn't feel right leaving it there, so he ad libbed "Welcome to Prime Time," and I think that's the reason none of the other quips really land, because I think at that point when you get in other movies, they're either trying to script those lines or
Yeah.
telling him when to ad lib. Like, Robert, ad lib now, or Rob, they're instructing him to riff as opposed to it being a natural thing.
Yeah. The other quip that sort of comes up later on is when Taryn is fighting him. She's got her giant mohawk spiked up off her head. She's dressed in black leather, and she's been dealing with addiction, and she's feeling, she's in recovery. And Freddy, again, very cruelly comes at her with, instead of knife fingers, he has these needle fingers that are filled with, some kind of drug. And, when he gets her, pins her against the wall, and she looks down and sees the wounds on her arms sort of like opening like mouths and like sort of gesturing hungrily for Freddy's needles. He stabs her. She has that kind of like bladder
Yeah,
effect pulsing in her
the veins crawl.
temples,
Yeah,
the veins, and he says, "What a rush!"
yeah,
And
yeah.
it doesn't land. It doesn't land as well as the other one, but it's also part of the start of his quippiness.
I'll tell you the other one in the movie that I actually really liked was when he was fighting Will, the Wizard Master.
Mm.
I really enjoyed that whole sequence, and I find myself like my wife jokes because I'll quote that like I'll be like, "Will, you look tired. Have a seat."
Oh, yeah. And the chair that's coming for him is
It's the
filled
chair
with
for you.
spikes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I actually enjoyed that one a bit. I think Robert was doing his best Freddy in this film.
yeah. Oh God, it's really just it's just a remarkable film. I have a couple more sort of things to get into maybe before we finish up.
Sure.
Hollywood nightmares versus like real nightmares. Do you how does this film get it right? Does the Elm Street series get it right? Are there any images or moments that really feel like that could actually be a nightmare to you? Because I know sometimes it feels like, oh, we're on a Hollywood set, the editing is
I,
being done by somebody, so this is being filmed, there's a camera there. What parts of these films feel like an actual nightmare to you?
I think in the original Elm Street, Wes Craven's, I think he really had a way to get closer to like the strangeness of dream imagery. I'm thinking specifically like that hallway school scene that was just super surreal with Nancy roaming through the hall and the body bags at the end. Like his construction of nightmares felt like real nightmares to me. In Elm Street 3, I think the closest that felt like a real nightmare to me was Kristen's initial dream. When we're first introduced to her, she's holding that little girl and running through the house.
Oh my God,
Yeah,
yeah,
that
scary.
everything else after that, I can't think of really a specific nightmare in the series after that that felt like, at least it didn't feel like a dream I would ever have. It felt
Mhm.
more constructed around the personality of the person that was being killed, very much playing into the tongue-in-cheek jokiness that they tried to expand upon after 3. The most obvious culprit to me being the Roach Motel kill
Mm.
in Elm Street 4. So no, I don't.
They could have had the roaches come out of a VHS box.
Right. But I don't think those movies really represent what I would consider to feel like a nightmare I'm familiar with. I think
Yeah.
there are filmmakers who really get close to that feel these days. Ari Aster comes to mind
Oh yeah.
specifically. I think about like there was stuff in Hereditary that was everyday stuff that felt nightmarish to me.
Yeah.
And I think there are people. I just saw Talk to Me.
Oh
Have you
yeah.
seen it yet?
Yeah. What did you think?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought
I
those
did
those
too.
those filmmakers are excellent, and I think
Yeah.
they really were able to kind of play with the audience's imagination. So you feel, I think that movie has nightmarish feelings to it on purpose that they constructed that probably read better than the Elm Street nightmares.
Yeah. I mean, is there like, now that you're on this topic, is there anybody else out there who's capable of doing this? I mean, we all have seen David Lynch. David
Yeah,
Lynch, I think, is
yeah.
comes closest to me. Mulholland Drive feels like one whole dream to me. That actually feels like something I would have seen in a dream.
Who made It Follows? Because there were sequences in that movie,
Oh
and,
yeah.
and I know and I know it was repetitive. Like I know it was kind of like the same gag, and I'm trying to use that generously, the same gag over and over. But that felt like there were moments. I'll tell you a story. When I saw that in theaters, I was good through almost the middle of the film. I'm
Mhm.
enjoying it. It's well made, and in the middle of the film, a person comes into the theater late. They walk in, they start walking up the stairs, and it was the first time in my adult life I almost ran out of the theater,
Oh
and
my.
I recognized that they got me.
I love that movie. I actually, I don't know what it is about the film. I probably would have, I would love to have a discussion about it with somebody. It's like part of it is the music, part of it is the way it almost feels like it is. And this is the dreamlike quality about it. It feels like it's set in an alternative universe
Mm-hmm.
of modernity.
Mm-hmm.
That's a word. The director, I looked it up. His name is David Robert Mitchell, and I think he came from indie, sort of like realistic teen genre.
So, I mean, but to get back to your question about do I think the films get real nightmares right? I think in order to get a real nightmare right, it would be almost incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. That's not a word. Incomprehensible. It would be almost incomprehensible to a mass audience.
Yeah,
It might connect with a few people, but I think a real nightmare would not film well. I think
yeah.
Wes Craven got close.
Yeah, I think there has to be a kind of a modification
Hmm.
for storytelling purposes. I think you're right, and that makes a lot of sense. I think unless there's anything else you want to talk about, I wanted to get kind of end with a question.
Hmm.
Which dream power would you have wanted as a kid to fight the boogeyman in your dreams?
I think super strength, real super strength, not medium strength. Sorry, Kincaid. Sorry, Kincaid. I think medium strength is fine for him. It worked in the moment, but I think real super strength. I just feel like I'm a small person. I was a small kid. The idea of being strong was something to aspire to, and it's something I chased in real life for a long time in my youth, just with the gym, lifting weights, trying to
Hmm.
get as strong as possible. And so I think that's a power I would have gravitated towards in an effort to fight the boogeyman. But since Kincaid sort of had that power, I want to bring up
Yeah,
something that
yeah.
really struck me about the movie too. As a kid watching horror movies,
Hmm.
black people in horror movies typically had a short shelf life.
Hmm.
Elm Street was one of the first movies I saw where not only did the black guy survive, two black guys survived because Max the Orderly and Kincaid were both alive at the end of this film. And that's something that has stuck with me for years and years and years and years. I've actually done talks about it. I did a talk called Avenge Kincaid, where I talked about how
Yeah,
big a deal it was for him to have survived this film and then be summarily dispatched in
I
part four.
know. Oh, it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
I hate when the final girl, final guy trope survives the movie and then the sequel takes him out right away.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a common trope. We've seen it among many franchises, but
Oh
that
yeah.
one particularly stung. And
Mm,
so I got to say, that's another reason three resonates with me so much. It's
yeah.
two black guys made it.
Yeah.
That was a rare thing.
Yeah. I I figured,
Hmm.
I didn't want to ask about it, but I'm glad you brought it up because
Hmm.
it's so like it's not even. I mean, I don't think there's black people in the first two films.
Yeah, I don't recall
I don't think there's a
any.
single black character,
Yeah.
and so we have this film which introduces two
Hmm.
people of color, and yeah, and they both survive. It's almost, it shouldn't feel groundbreaking, but like unfortunately for that time, you
Yeah.
know. I mean, for me, I probably would have chosen the power of flight.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
fly me the hell out of there.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have seen if they were ever to make another Nightmare on Elm Street, like because flying in dreams is such a, I don't know, like a wish fulfillment kind of thing. If they were to make another one, like add a kid who can fly away from Freddy and see if Freddy flies after him.
Have you seen Doctor Sleep?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Mike Flanagan has spoken about Elm Street 3 having
Oh,
a lot of influence on his storytelling, and particularly there are elements of it in that film. And I only bring it up because he has a cool dream fly sequence in there.
that's right.
Mm.
It's a
Yeah.
beautiful dream fly sweet sequence, and Rose the Hat is such a great character in the film. Yeah, it's. Have you ever had dreams of flying?
Sure, sure. And it feels exhilarating. Like I've often dreamed as a child, particularly, that I was Superman. The thing when I would be scared to sleep by myself and scared of the shadows, I would hum the Superman score
Hmm.
until I fell asleep.
I
And
love that.
and that would not I wouldn't say often, but more than once that would lead into a dream of flying like Superman.
Yeah. I think that's a really cool way to end this conversation is to sort of end with a talisman of safety.
Absolutely.
Singing yourself a song to comfort yourself, and hopefully it won't be, you will never choose that 1-2 Freddy's coming for you
Never.
song instead.
Never.
Well, thank you so much, Lamar, for coming in and talking about this. This was such a great conversation, and you really opened my eyes to a lot of stuff I hadn't thought about before.
Well, thank you for having me. No, this was great. I really love what you're doing here, Dan. I appreciate you letting me be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you. I just have to say how fun it was to really kind of kiki about Freddy Krueger with Lamar. He's a huge fan, as am I, and I feel like our conversation shows our crazy enthusiasm for Wes Craven's lore. Does that make us geeks? Nerds? I don't really care. I'm not going to stop loving the scary, gory stuff that I've grown up loving, and I hope Lamar never stops either. I'd like to thank Lamar for giggling with me, and for repeatedly blowing my mind. There were several moments during our chat that left me truly speechless. I tried to leave some of that space for you all to hear, so I went a little lighter on the edit button this time around. Again, for a great horror chiller, check out Lamar's The Getaway. It's an incredibly fast-moving thrill ride of a story, but also so much more, with some of the most gorgeously creepy cover art of the past year. Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like, you can follow our social media at Our First Fears, one word, on the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Instagram. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. Which Elm Street film is your favorite? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.